Hello everyone. I hope you guys are having fun. I'm Kia. Thank you so much for having me. It's a really huge honor for me, and I would like to thank all of the Vuejs Amsterdam organizers and staffs for making this happen. I know how hard it is to organize the event of this size, so thank you so much, Vuejs Amsterdam, and thank you all for joining this big event. Today, I would like to talk about Vuex 5 deep dive. For any of you saw my previous talk last year, I've talked about VX5 ideas. It might share lots of similar things, but we do have update on APIs. And moreover, this time I will walk through a bit more on details on how VX5 works internally. But before going into the topics, please let me introduce myself a bit. I'm Kia, I live in Japan, and I'm one of the Vue.js core team member, and my main focus is, obviously, Vuex. I'm also a creator of Vuex plugin called Vuex ORM, and I'm working at Global Brain, which is one of the largest venture capital in Japan, but we do have office all over the world. So if there's any startups attending this event, and if you need any investments, don't hesitate to contact me. So I guess that's enough about me. Let's dive into VX5. Today, I would like to talk about two topics. First, I would like to talk about the state of Vuex, what is going on with the current Vuex. Then I would talk about VX5. Well, mainly this is going to be the 95% of the talk. First things first, Vuex 4 is out. It's no longer beta or RC. It's officially released as a stable version. Now, it's still published under the next tag at npm, as same as Vue 3, but as soon as Vue 3 is published under the latest tag, Vuex4 would do the same. So we have Vuex3 for Vue 2, and Vuex4 is for Vue 3. Yes, I know it's confusing, but please remember this mapping. Vuex3 will not work on Vue 3, and Vuex4 will not work with Vue 2. Now, Vuex3 is going to be supported as long as Vue 2 is supported. So if you are using Vue 2 at the moment, and if you're planning to keep using Vue 2, don't worry, Vuex3 will always be there for you as long as Vue 2 is supported. The focus of Vuex4 is the compatibility. So Vuex4 is a compatible version of Vuex3 for Vue 3 with the exact same API as Vuex3. In other words, there is no big change in Vuex4 compared to Vuex3, only it works with Vue 3. There are small breaking changes from Vuex3, but it should be minimum, and it should be easy to update from Vuex3 to Vuex4. Please refer to the release note of Vuex4 if you're interested. Now, let's move to the main topic, the Vuex5. Well, Vuex5 idea goes long way back to almost as old as Vue 3 development started. We had Vuex improvements proposal RFC published once, but then the Vue 3's new reactivity system and composition API came out, and we dropped Vuex RFC so that we can maybe rethink about how Vuex works, especially with the new Vue's reactivity system and composition API. Even after that, we had lots of proposals internally at the core team to make Vuex better. And the proposal goes on, and finally, we're getting very close to that point where we feel like it's the right path for the next version of Vuex. So before going into the new features of Vuex, let me talk a little bit about Vuex5 concepts. The focus of Vuex5 is to create an official global state management tool for Vue. The keyword here is the word global. The global state is a state shared between Vue components which are not in parent-child relationship. If the component has parent-child relationship, which means if the component is nested under some component, you can always use props to pass data. But the shared state between sibling components could be challenging. For example, if you want to share the state between different pages when you're using Vue Router, if you want to share state between page A and page B, it could be challenging. And Vuex is one of the official way to do that easily. So for global state management, what we really need is define global state and also provide a way to mutate them. We want code splitting. Although Vuex is a global state management tool, it would be nice if the state is only loaded in the component that requires it. For example, if we have component A, B, and C, and if component A and B is the only component that requires the global state, when loading component C, it shouldn't be requiring the whole global state to be loaded. In Vuex 3 and Vuex 4, you can do that by using register module method, but it has to be done manually. And it would be much nicer if we can make this happen automatically. It should also support server-side rendering. It should also support DevTools. And finally, it should be extensible. It should be easy to add new features on top of Vuex. Because creating global state might be easy for like simple use cases, you might just use plain composable function to achieve it. But it's going to be challenging to actually support all of the things listed here. For example, server-side support and DevTools support. Well, yes, you can do that by implementing all of that features by yourself, but it should be much nicer if the official plugin can take care of it. And if you still want to implement some more advanced state management pattern, ideally, it should be easy to do that by extending Vuex rather than creating all of these fundamental features by yourself. So these are the core focus of Vuex 5. It's meant to be an official plugin that manages the global state on Vue. So having that in mind, what's new in Vuex 5? Well, it supports both Options API and Composition API. It has complete TypeScript support. Not only the code will be rewritten in TypeScript, every single API should be typed. No mutations, only actions. So we see lots of confusion and inconvenience with mutations and actions in Vuex 3 and Vuex 4. There are clear separation of concern, actually, where actions can be asynchronous, but mutations has to be synchronous. But when you're building a reasonably large apps, mutation becomes just a bunch of setters, like all it does is state.name equals name. So we think it's better if we have only one single way to mutate the state. No nested modules, compose instead. So current Vuex has module system that can be nested and used in another store. The module system was introduced to namespace the specific part of the store, and also it enables to use one module inside another module as well. But the current problem of modules is that you have to manually register them. So let's say you have modules that is being used only in like 2 components. And if you only want to add modules when users are actually using that component, you have to manually register them inside a component via register module method. Also, it's making hard for TypeScript to type it because dynamically added modules can never be typed. So in Vuex 5, we introduced composition of the stores. By doing this, we get automated code splitting. So if you have a store that is only being used in specific part of the store should only be loaded when users are actually on that component, right? And it should be automated. Now, these are the key features of Vuex 5. Let's walk through the code and see how Vuex 5 will look like. First step, let's define the store. Here, we'll first create an Options API store. As I said, Vuex 5 supports both Options API and Composition API. Now, we're creating Options API store here. Now, in Vuex 5, instead of defining modules, we define a store. We use this new define store function to do so. It's not create store, it's define store. And we're naming the returned object as use counter. Any of you who are familiar with the Composition API will probably know what this means, but at the moment we're creating Options API store. We'll come back to this naming later on, so don't care much right now. Now this is just an empty store, so we have to define a state and such. The first thing you need to define is a key property. This is going to be the identifier of the store. This store is called counter. This key has to be unique because Vuex store is global. It needs a way to determine whether the 2 different store is the same store or not. For that, we use this key property. Next, we add state. This is the same as current Vuex. You pass the default state, and that's it. It has to be function, but it works just as current Vuex. Now let's define getters. Here it becomes a little bit more interesting. It's the same as current Vuex, except it doesn't take any arguments. You can see that double method here is referencing this context to reference the state. So maybe some of you are getting confused here, but stay with me. Next, let's add actions. Again, same as getters. If it references the state through this. Now, how you access the state inside the store is more unified. You can simply access them through this context as if it were a view component. I hope all of this makes sense. It really looks just like a view component in Options API. Now, we have a store definition, but this is just a definition. So you can't really use this just yet. To use the store, we need a small setup. First, we create new Vuex instance. It's not a store instance anymore, it's a Vuex instance. Then you can call vuex.store method and pass in the previously created store definition. In this case, it is called useCounter. Now, I'll explain why we need this new instance concept in a bit, but at the moment, let's continue how we can use this counter store. After we get the store instance through vuex.store method, we can use that store as if it was a simple object. As you can see here, counter.count is 1, count double is 2, because remember, the double is a getter. So it acts like a computed property in view component. Then you call action, increment. This is going to increment the state value. Then after that, you get new state. So counter.count is 2, and counter double is 4. This normal dispatch or commit function, it is as if it was a simple object. I think this makes much more sense, and it makes much easier to use Vuex, especially for someone who's new to Vuex or Vue. Also, this is completely typed. Everything is typed here. And the best part is you don't have to do anything to get this typed. You don't even have to define any generics. This is all typed, just like view component is typed. I don't even have to show you the example of TypeScript because this is a valid TypeScript. This is already typed. Now, this is how you would use store outside of view component. But how do we use it inside a view component? At first, you need to pass the Vuex instance to the app.use method. This is going to install Vuex into the Vue app instance, and you'll get access to the Vuex instance inside Vue component. So essentially, here we're installing Vuex to Vue. Next, inside a Vue component, just like Vuex 3 and Vuex 4, you will fetch the store inside computed property. In this case, we have counter computed property, and it is returning the store instance as same as I've shown you before through vuex.store method. Now you can use the counter object inside the template. Simple. Again, this is as same as how you would access any computed value in Vue component. But this is kind of overwhelming because you have to define multiple computed property for each store. And I know this $vuex.store doesn't look pretty at all. So we have this map stores helper functions. Just like helper functions in current Vuex, you can just pass in multiple stores and it gets mapped to the Vue component. The rest is the same. So to be honest, I'm not 100% sure with the naming of the store definition. Now we're passing useCounter to the map stores helper function. It might feel weird to have use prefix object showing up on Options API, maybe. But it's just a naming, so you can name the object whatever you want. You don't have to name it useCounter. You can name it like counter store or anything that you like. So at the moment, we'll just stick to the useCounter for this presentation, but just remember that this is not something that's fixed. You can use any name that you like. So now, the interesting thing is that the store now looks almost identical to Vue component. As I've mentioned earlier, like if you change state to data and getters to computed, options to method, it really is the same as Vue component. This makes it easy to move your Vue component logic into the store. So you can probably, in many cases, just copy the function to the store and it should still work. We did hear many feedbacks where you first start defining component and all of the logics, and later on you decided to move to the Vuex because you find that logic to be global. It isn't that easy to do that in Vuex 3 and 4 because the API is pretty much different. But in Vuex 5, it should be much easier to do that. moving the logic between stores and view component. Now, this is options API. The store was written in options API, right? And now you can also use composition API in Vuex5. It looks like this. We use the same define store function to define a store, but instead of passing in the object, we first pass the key of the store, and then we pass callback function. This function behaves exactly the same as Vue's composition functions. You can use all of the Vue's reactivity stuff inside here. We don't have any predefined state or getters or actions. We're using ref to define the reactive state or value, using computed for computed value, and a simple function to mutate the value. You can, of course, use any other reactivity stuff as well, like reactive function or watch function. So you get complete freedom here. And not to mention, this is also very friendly to TypeScript. Everything is typed here. And to use that inside setup in view component, you may just call the useCounter function as if it were a simple composable function. Now, this is why the object is called useCounter. It's actually a function, not an object. You don't have to call vuex.store or anything inside setup. You can directly call useCounter function. So this is cool. It just acts like a simple composition function, but how does it work? Now let's deep dive on this one. How does this whole vuex.store thing works? And why do we need them? At first, let's see what we need here. As a Vuex, we need stores to be a global, which means we should be able to do this. In this slide, you can see that we are calling useCounter twice. So we have counter A object and counter B object. And these two has to be the exact same store because it's a global state, right? So here, first we load counter A, and we are calling counter A.increment, which increments the state of the store. And then we're creating another store, which is counter B. At this point, counter B.count should be 2, because counter A and counter B should be the same store. Obviously, this is what we want, but how do we do this? Well, this is the reason why we have this new view instance concept. At first, we're creating this Vuex instance here. This is actually creating a store registries inside Vuex, which is just a simple object that contains all of the stores that is being used inside the app. So at first, when we create new Vuex instance, it would have empty registry. It's just empty object. Now, then we call useCounter for the first time. It creates a new store from the useCounter definition and registers it to the Vuex registries. So inside Vuex registry will look something like this. Vuex registry now has a counter store, which is named being counter. And when we call useCounter for the second time, it just returns the already registered counter store. Therefore, we always get the exact same store object. This is the reason why we install Vuex instance to the Vue app instance. Remember that when we want to use a store inside the Vue component, at first we'll register the Vuex instance to the Vue app instance via app.use method. Then inside the Vue component, in options API, we can always retrieve the store from the injected Vuex instance, like this. This is exactly the same as calling vuex.store method outside a Vue component. When calling useCounter inside setup directly in composition API, we can still retrieve the Vuex instance through Vue's provide inject method. This is possible because Vuex instance is injected into Vue app, which means when you want to use stores outside of Vuex, you should always use vuex.store method. You can't call useCounter method directly because it wouldn't know how to get Vuex instance. Always use vuex.store method outside of Vue. Now, the benefit about using this vuex.store approach is that it enables automated code splitting. So stores are only imported in the component which actually use it. So your bundlers like Webpack or Rollup can simply strip the unused stores from the bundles, so you can reduce the bundle size. This happens completely automatically and is transparent. You don't have to do register module or anything anymore. You can just use store at the place that store is required, and it's automatically code splitted. Now we know how to define a store and use them and how it works. This is the essential of Vuex 5, the fundamentals. So you can define store and use it. It's pretty much it. But how can we use a store inside another store? In current Vuex, you can use modules to do that. But in Vuex 5, we don't have modules anymore. So how can we do this? Well, we use store composition. So let's say we have this greeter store. It's defined in options API. It only has a single state property called greet. And let's say we want to use this greeter store inside previously defined counter store. Let's first take a look at options API pattern. Here we have use counter store, which uses greeter store. You can see this new use property, which is this one. Inside this function, you return any numbers of stores you would like to use inside the store. It acts the same as map stores helper function in Vue component. Then you can just access it through this context. Internally, all it does is calling vuex.stores for you. You can access greeter store in both getters and actions. Again, this aligns very well with Vue options API component. You can always access additional things through this context. Now, what about in composition API store? This is how it would look like using another store inside composition store. Unlike options API, you may just simply call useGreeter method inside callback function. You can see it over here. Instead of having use property or anything, you could just call useGreeter and that's it. And to make sure, you can just reference it anywhere inside the store callback function. Now, this looks simple, but how do we retrieve useGreeter when we call it like this? I mean, how can we retrieve Vuex instance? Because remember, we must retrieve stores from Vuex instance, always. But how can we do this? Well, when useCounter is called inside setup hook, there's no problem. Here, useCounter is calling useGreeter under the hood, but still, it is called inside setup hook. So useGreeter can still retrieve injected Vuex instance through inject method of Vue. So in this case, it's fine, it will just work. But what if we want to call useCounter outside of Vue, like this? Again, remember, useCounter is calling useGreeter under the hood. Now, useCounter is being called through vuex.store method. So useCounter had no problem accessing Vuex instance, as I explained earlier. But useGreeter function, there's no Vuex store method here. And useCounter is being called outside of setup hook. So we can't use inject method to retrieve Vuex instance. Now we have problem. Well, one way to solve this problem is to explicitly call vuex.store method inside useCounter callback function, like this. Here we have this new use method passed into the callback function as an argument. This is actually what I was doing when I presented Vuex 5 idea last year. So this use method is just an alias of vuex.store method. So essentially, what this is doing is this. It is just calling vuex.store. Well, this works, obviously. But nah, I don't know. It doesn't look good, right? Isn't it? So we want this. It looks much cleaner. And if you had to call that use method into the store, it would be so easy to forget. I can imagine time to time we forget to call use method and we get some errors, and that should be pretty annoying. So it's so much better if we could just simply call useGreeter method directly. Less thing to remember, right? Now, to be able to do this, we're going to introduce the global Vuex registry, not the store registry, but Vuex instance registry. Now, this is a little bit complicated idea to show in the slides, but it's simpler than it looks. Here is how it looks like. Now, this is a fake code do not try to paste and run this code, please. I mean, the function vuex.store is not even correct JavaScript syntax. This is just to demonstrate the basic idea on how this global registry works. So here we have current vuex variable, which is a global singleton. And when we call vuex_store method, we'll set the current instance, current active instance to vuex, this current vuex variable. Then, when calling useCounter method, it will retrieve the current vuex instance from the global vuex instance. useGreeter function will do the same too. Now, of course, this is not the actual code that is going to look like, but probably vuex instance will be registered to a map rather than single let variable. But again, I think you'll get the idea. We set active instance globally and retrieve it. This is what Vue3 does in composition API. When you call, for example, get current instance method, or when you use provide and inject method, it's retrieving current Vue app instance like this. So we do the same for vuex. By doing so, when we call useGreeter function inside counter store, it can correctly retrieve vuex instance. Now, this was maybe complicated, but I too think it's complicated when I try to explain this in the slides, but all you need to know is that you can simply call useGreeter inside another store, and it should work fine even outside of Vue component. So finally, these are the core features of Vuex5. You can define store and retrieve it as simply as possible. I didn't show any example on using more advanced features like watch, but those are supported as well. You can just call watch function inside composition store, or you can even define watch property in options API as well. But the point is, Vuex5 is much simpler than Vuex4. It has all required features to create global state. Although these are the core features of Vuex5, there's another feature we must have, which is plugins. So Vuex should be pluggable so that we can extend its functionality. For example, what if we want to use Axios inside stores to call APIs? You can add any plugins like this. This plugin feature is inspired by Nuxt, so the plugin function will get access to provide method, and you can just provide a method, give it a name, and the object that you would like to provide to the Vuex instance. Here we can see that we are calling provide method, giving Axios as its name, and Axios object for that name. Now, inside store definition, in options API store, you can access that Axios through $Axios property. Again, very similar to how Vue component handle these kind of plugins. It's prefixed by $ by default, so to avoid any name collisions. And in composition API store, you have access to the Axios object inside context object, which is passed to the callback function, like this. Really simple. It also gets $ prefix, the same as options API to avoid any name conflicts. So using plugin features, you can inject whatever object you wish. For TypeScript support, you have to provide a type definition for that object, but it's simple as this. Again, it's pretty much same as how Nuxt defined the types. You need to define interface for both options API and also for context object for composition API, but I think this is straightforward enough. So that's how you would inject some additional property into the store, but how would we really extend Vuex functionalities? To do that, the plugin method will also provide Vuex instance as well. So you may add any functionality to Vuex itself. You may add any additional property to Vuex instance like this. Well, yeah, I know who would do this, right? But the point is you can extend Vuex as much as you want. So Vuex5 is no longer Flux like it is in Vuex4. Now, don't get me wrong here, right? I'm not trying to start a war about whether Vuex is Flux or not, but it doesn't have same APIs anymore. But by making plugin, we could implement Flux-like API in Vuex5 too, if we want, by adding dispatch and commit function like this. If there are many demands, I might create this plugin. I don't know. If you want, please let me know. The point is, we can extend Vuex5 to add any extra functionality that you want so that we can extend Vuex5 to implement any specific global state management pattern that you want, like Flux. So that is for Vuex pretty much. I think you all got a brief idea on how direction for the Vuex 5. So I think the next question is, when will we see VX5 RFC? Last year, I said after VX 4.0.0 release. So the answer is almost. We're now finalizing the RFC internally. There are a few things we want to prototype before we make the RFC public, but once that's done, it should be out pretty soon. And a final note, the current VX5 ideas are still unstable. APIs and overall architecture is subject to change in the final RFC. However, if you have any questions or ideas, please don't hesitate to contact me. You can ping me at Twitter, and I'll be more than happy to discuss with you. Also, once RFC is out, we should have more discussion going on publicly, and it might bring new ideas to overall APIs as well, which I'm looking pretty much forward to it. I'm Kia. Again, thank you so much for having me. I hope you continue to enjoy this conference. Thank you so much. See you around.